Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you might be. Thank you for joining us here on Peak Policy. I'm Chris Cargill, president of the Mountain States Policy Center, and we're glad to have you with us here as we put a bow or a wrap on our legislative sessions. Although things are still going on in a few of the states, there is plenty to talk about before things finally come to an end, not only here in Idaho, but all across the Mountain States as well. It's a busy time of year for legislators, busy time of year for watching what happens in the legislative session. And one of the busiest people that I know is MSPC's Vice President, Director of our research program, Jason Mercier, who's going to be talking a little bit with us about some of the budget and tax issues that are coming up in this legislative session. Bob Pishue is one of our new policy analysts at Mountain States Policy Center. He's going to be talking to us about transportation issues that have been front and center, not only here in Idaho, but across Washington and Montana as well. Madi Clark is one of our policy analysts here at Mountain States Policy Center. She'll be joining us here in a few minutes as well, in addition to Sebastian Griffin, who's also one of our policy analysts, talking with us about technology issues that are front and center. So all of these folks are here to answer any questions that you might have if you're watching live on Facebook, on Twitter, on X, on LinkedIn, and a whole host of other platforms that you might be paying attention to this program. So write your questions in the chat, and we will get to them throughout the program today. Jason, let's start with you to talk about what's happening budget and tax-wise, and we'll start with Idaho. What information do you have for us? There's been some fireworks on the floor of the state Senate today in Idaho.
Well, first of all, it's nice to be part of the Brady Bunch policy team. It's a pretty good screenshot there of what we're working on and all the researchers at MSPC. But for Idaho on the tax and budget front, the taxes are pretty much cooked. We know that it was a very good session for taxpayers, hundreds of millions of dollars in tax relief. I think the major headline, especially when you look at nationally, one of the main economic battles, if you will, between the states is reducing the income tax burden. And, there's another state that might have jumped ahead of us, which we can talk about, the Mississippi in a moment. But Idaho started the session off from Governor Little's State of the State, talking about continuing their tax relief efforts. Initially, Governor Little was talking around $100 million. And the legislature's response was, that's nice, but we're going to go even larger. And I think when all is said and done, we're going to be almost up to $500 million of additional tax relief. Keynoted with the income tax reductions, that's around a $235 million savings. And it's really important because that rate dropping, we're still among the highest in the region, but at least we're going to be lower than Montana. And that's going to continue to put us on the path to, with additional revenue growth, buy down that rate even more. You also saw probably the biggest and toughest fight of the session concerning education choice. That House Bill 93 was passed, signed into law. That's a $50 million tax credit for parents to pursue additional education options. You also saw the recommendation that we made to increase the grocery tax rebate. That's another $50 million in savings for taxpayers. And the final one on property taxes is kind of a unique debate in Idaho because Idaho does not have a statewide property tax. The property tax is all at the local level. That's a budget-driven process. So as a taxpayer, I am happy to get tax relief. And the legislature this year is taking state funds, $100 million of state funds, basically to buy down some of that local property tax burden. So from a taxpayer standpoint, that's great. But when you realize those are state funds and that is a local property tax being driven by local spending, in the future, you'd like to see some type of controls more on that local spending, since that's what's driving the tax burden, and use those state funds to further buy down state taxes. It would have been great to use that $100 million to even further buy down the state income tax rate to help the state's competitiveness. But at the end of the day, when you've got income tax relief, property tax relief, grocery sales tax relief, and you're getting a new education choice tax credit, a pretty good session for taxpayers in Idaho.
Yeah, Jason, I was going to mention, I think this is one of the most conservative legislative sessions that we've seen in Idaho in quite some times in terms of getting free market policy across the finish line. Just a reminder for folks who are watching, you have any questions or comments, add them to the chat and we will read them throughout the program today. But Jason, this has been pretty remarkable in terms of free market reforms, the lowering of these taxes, education choice, pretty big victories for Idahoans here in the legislative session. I want to go through a few of the budgets that have been out there, and we're going to be putting a focus on all of these budgets on our social media channels, on our website as well. But just to give you kind of an indication of how Idaho does its budgets, they do it by department here. So there are good parts about that, Jason, in that you can see department by department what has been approved, how many FTEs we're talking about, the total allocation, and so on.
Yeah, the Idaho budget process is really unique. It has some great best practices that you'd like to see other states do, but a couple of hiccups that they're working through, and that's partly why they're still in session. I thought they were going to be out a week ago, but only a fraction of the budgets are done. And when you look at other states, Montana, Wyoming, Washington, they kind of do one giant budget bill, 1,000-page, it drops, and you vote on everything. And if you're lucky enough to hang an amendment, maybe you can change a spending level. Idaho, as you indicated, it's not one master omnibus budget. It is not only agency by agency, but it can be programs within agencies. So when all is said and done, you're going to have probably over 100 different bills that will make up the Idaho budget. But that's why they're still going, and they'll probably go on a little bit longer, because that's a lot of budgets to go through. And it starts off in a very unique, very transparent process called the JFAC committee. It's a joint finance committee between the House and the Senate. It's taking basically the appropriations committees from both the bodies and they merge them together. And every single day during session, if you want to spend 3 hours of your morning, you can pretend you're a budget writer. You're seeing live through these JFAC hearings all the information they have. They're making their decisions in a public hearing. So there's no waiting for the white smoke to rise behind the Capitol dome that you see in these other states to figure out what's in the budget. Every single day. Now, part of that challenge then, though, is when you're doing that on every single agency and you're talking about hundreds of bills the legislature has to pass, that's a lot of extra work. That takes some time. And as you indicated today, there was some concern that, are we sacrificing getting out earlier for more time to debate these bills? Because, lawmakers obviously want to talk to each of these individual bills, and that takes time. So I believe a rule was approved today in the Senate to reduce the amount of time so they can try to expedite this a little bit. So there's a pull and, push and pull on that, the transparency for the expediency. But the bottom line is there's no mystery what's in these. It's not like other states where you don't know what's being considered. It's coming out of JFAC, and then you have the debates on the floors.
Jason, every time a bill is introduced, an angel gets its wings. So look at all these different bills that have been introduced. I mean, pretty remarkable here. And we're going to talk about Washington, Montana, and Wyoming as well. But the numbers of our legislative bill counter is what is just remarkable to me. We've already surpassed the record here in Idaho with 750 bills introduced, and there are still more that are being introduced. 1983, great year. 3 years after I was born, but maybe not so great for the folks of Washington, who are dealing with almost 2,000 pieces of legislation. Montana is still, they got a couple of months to go here, Jason, so they could very easily pass Washington. Wyoming seems to be the only good one here. 555 bills. That hasn't changed in a couple of months. And the reason for that is because the Wyoming legislature already adjourned. So they're done with their session for this year.
Yeah, to use your angels getting their wings, Clarence is very happy with our states because we are single-handedly populating heaven, right? I think that a little caveat on those numbers, Idaho is a little, that 700 plus bills is a little bit deceptive because, again, that's a lot of budget bills because we just talked about how they do it by every agency. And Idaho also does something a little bit differently than the other states, is that when a bill is introduced in Washington, that's kind of it. And any changes to it happens through an amendment process. So you can have that one bill change 5, 6, 7 times before it actually comes to the floor. Now, that can happen in Idaho, but generally what happens is if they want to consider a different concept of a bill, they'll introduce a new bill. So you can have basically 2, 3 different bills doing the same thing rather than it just being amended. So again, 750 bills, we had to touch them all. We had to look at them all. Thankfully, Wonk is making that a little bit easier. But that Idaho number is going to be like a little bit higher than if you're actually comparing it with Montana and Washington, because those are actually individual concepts versus just changes to an existing concept.
Questions or comments, add them to the chat. Again, we're going to get to Bob, Maddie, and Sebastian here in just a moment. I want to take this question, Jason, from Gary. In Idaho, what is the form of the $100 million reduction to property taxes? Is it a tax credit? What is it?
Yeah, so again, they're using the state resources to buy down this local property tax rate. So it's going to come in a couple of ways because they're also doing it to try to reduce some of the impact that the school costs have. Because again, when you're talking about the property tax, and this is one of the reasons why we're a big supporter of truth in taxation, is if you are just doing a rebate or you're just doing an assessment restriction, you're not getting to the root of the cause. The root of the cause is the local spending. And that's why I think going forward, you'd like to see more of the attention in the legislature be about controlling that local spending increase, giving more transparency to it with truth in taxation. So you're not having a situation of state taxpayers subsidizing local spending increases.
Jason, one more question from Norris here. Again, put your questions in the chat if you have them. Norris says, "I know you've covered this before. What's the best response to the people who hate the education choice bill and believe that public schooling is harmed by this?"
Well, there's a couple of other bills moving forward on public education that I think came out of that House Bill 93 debate. As part of the debate that was around the tax credit is, why are we providing options for parents to go to a school that doesn't have the same type of restrictions or regulations that our public schools have? That's the great argument, right? There shouldn't be those type of regulations on the public schools. So the answer isn't to restrict access and options for parents and students. It's to reduce that regulatory burden on the existing public schools. And there's been a couple of bills introduced. They haven't made it all the way through the process yet, but they're kind of taking a page out of what happened in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Those that may recall, back in 2005, massive devastations in New Orleans. There was a big question about how did they move forward quickly. So what they did on education is basically the entire New Orleans school district became charter schools. All of the contracts were torn up, all the regulations were torn up, and they all had innovative ways to try to address student needs. Not surprisingly, when they had that flexibility, you saw test scores dramatically increase. You saw graduation rates dramatically increase, because when you're not focusing all your time on dotting the I's and crossing the T's and focusing on what's needed for the students, you can improve student outcomes. So I think those bills that have been introduced to kind of complement what happened on the education choice for House Bill 93, to allow public schools to become innovative districts, to be free of some of the regulations. And if you combine that with what Superintendent Critchfield wants to do with the closing of the Federal Department of Education, block granting money back down to the states, well, then you could take that the next level down and do block grants down to the school districts without all the strings attached to them.
Let's bring in Madi Clark, who is one of our senior policy analysts, easy for me to say, here at Mountain States Policy Center, as well as Sebastian Griffin, who is the director of our Center for Technology and Innovation at MSPC. Madi, what are some of the bills that you've been watching this session? Again, we're only talking about Idaho at the moment. We're going to move on to some of the other states here in just a second. But for Idaho, what bills have you been watching?
So this session brought some new topics that kind of came all of a sudden. We had a debanking bill that we followed that was actually signed on Wednesday. And then we had some housing policy, temporary rules, childcare. I kind of covered a wide range. It was very eclectic this year.
Madi, I know the debanking bill was one that we covered very, very closely. And I think part of the reason for that is not necessarily because it was, you certainly understand the concern that people have about debanking, but whether it needs to be a local policy adoption, it needs to be a federal issue, it needs to be a state issue. What is some of the research that you found on that particular topic?
Thank you, Chris. Well, this is definitely a result of federal apathy leading to state action that was unneeded because it's a federal level solution that is needed. So debanking is the process where your account is discontinued and the bank does not have to give you a reason. And a lot of this can come down to political affiliation, religious beliefs, what you do for work, like do you manufacture ammunition? So underneath the Obama and the Biden administrations, there were instances where the banking regulators, because banks are highly regulated, there was actually a comment a few months ago from one of the largest banks in the nation saying he sees 100+ regulators a day. So this is definitely the federal regulators putting pressure on banks, and banks are the ones that are getting the consequences because they're facing the customers. They're the ones that are having to take action underneath all the regulations they have to follow. And then customers are debanked. And under the Obama and Biden administrations, we saw situations where certain businesses they didn't agree with, certain political groups had their accounts just discontinued, and they were left trying to find a way to still play in our economy, because we have to have a bank to be able to make payments with your debit card or cash your deposits from your members. Like it's a big issue. So states have had to take action because this has been a federal issue for years that the federal government has done nothing with, because they've been able to wield a political power they had no business wielding. And Idaho joined the list. Tennessee and Florida have already taken action. Idaho joined the list. We signed it into law on Wednesday. This is one of those things that we are hoping that they would just pause, because now that we have legislators in Congress that are paying attention to this issue, there were hearings in March led by Senator Tim Scott. They are taking action. They have a proposal that they've just put out called the Financial Integrity and Regulation Management Act that would have been taken care of at a federal level. But ours in Idaho was Senate Bill 1027, and it was actually one of the most encompassing debanking bills in the nation. It would have surpassed Tennessee and Florida. And really, it is going to be, the banks are going to be the one caught in the middle. They're going to have regulations from the federal government and regulations from the state level governments that actually disagree. So they're going to have to figure out how to walk that very narrow, sometimes cliff edge tightrope that they're now on.
Just a reminder to folks, if you're watching us live, you can add questions, comments to the chat. We have dozens of folks across dozens of platforms watching in different areas. You can ask any question that you might have. Hello, Benjamin. Good to see you. Thanks for being with us. And if you're watching on a tape delay basis on any of the platforms, you are welcome to email us questions as well, info@mountainstatespolicy.org. Maddie, I know you were also tracking some emergency powers reform issues from not necessarily Idaho. There were some bills introduced, but also some of the other states. Walk us through the issue as it stands today and why this is so important.
So the emergency power reform is one of those issues that in COVID, we saw where the abuse, the results of the abuse, right? We all had experiences where we didn't agree with the governor, and those emergency powers in certain states were allowed to extend and extend and extend. So now,
Maddie, we should be clear. We're talking about governors across the country. Yeah,
all of
not necessarily anyone
across the country. Correct. Yes, thank you. Yeah, governors across the country. We had some that handled it very, very well, and some that abused that power. And so, coming into these legislative sessions since COVID, we've had bills be introduced over and over again, trying to put reforms in place that would cap it. We look at Washington, and that's the poster child of, you do not want that long range authoritarian control from a governor. You want the legislature to be able to agree or disagree and to take actions regarding that. At the beginning of the session, we thought Washington was going to have some movement in this direction, and so far, those proposals tended to dry up. And then in our other states, Idaho is actually one of the best in our region. There are a couple of things that could be changed, but overall, the biggest issue is we just need to make sure that the legislature has an ability in a certain time frame to say, we agree, we disagree, in this emergency or continue this emergency. They need that voice and they need to be able to meet. And so that's really where you see the discrepancy. Like Utah and Idaho are very, very similar. Utah is only better because they have a quicker turnaround and fewer people that need to be contacted to call a session. So that's really where those metrics come into place. In Utah, it only takes the speaker and the majority leader, to call session in with the governor. In other states, it takes a vote of, in Oregon, it takes a vote of everybody, and it's like snail mail vote. So it takes weeks to get that response. So that's kind of where we see the emergency powers. I think it'll be a long-term issue that we continue seeing, because there are parties in every state that want to make sure that we maintain that balance of power and that we are also able, on the other hand, to respond to emergencies.
Madi Clark is one of our senior policy analysts here at MSPC. Madi, thanks for your work this session. Really appreciate it. We'll see you next week. Let's bring in Sebastian Griffin, who is the director of our Center for Tech and Innovation, the Junkermeyer Center for Tech and Innovation. Sebastian, I know you were called upon to testify in the Idaho legislative session about what we're calling the shot clock bill. Explain to folks what that is all about.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, House Bill 180 was the shot clock bill. And for those of you that are now getting on the internet and looking up shot clock, we're not talking about Montana implementing a shot clock in high school basketball, but it's kind of the same idea, just with a little bit of differences. Right now in Idaho, there is no time frame of when a response needs to be given to an applicant in regard to permitting on a utility or broadband. And House Bill 180 was there to close that gap. It's up right now. It's on the Senate side. It passed the House. On the Senate side, it was amended slightly, but we're currently going through the process to have that implemented. So what does it do? It requires municipalities or county commission groups, county commission permitting departments, that they have a required timeline to give a response. And if a response is not given, rather than turning the ball over to the other team, it's approving the permit up to that point. And there's different tiers, whether it be 30, 90, 180 days. But basically, it's allowing folks to have transparency in the permitting process, something that we expect from any group or organization, whether it be in public practice or private practice. We want a timeline. We want to know when we're going to see a return on our investment, a return on our time. And so I was called upon in the Senate side to testify on that. And it's currently on the floor, second reading calendar, ready to move forward here in the next few days.
And not only does Sebastian have the best hair of anybody at MSPC, he's also the only one who has shirts that have his name and a logo of his name on the shirt. Let's see that. Let's see that front and center.
I tried tilting it up before.
There you go. Griffin.
It says Griffin on there. It says Griffin Marketing, but you got to be proud of the family symbol, Griffin, and the Eagle mix. But I had my Mountain State shirt. I thought I'd put it on, but it happens to be a Griffin Marketing one. That's what I get for buying the same gear.
Sebastian, this is this shot clock legislation is something that a lot of other states are doing as well. I know you've attended some conferences on this, and you were in Florida last year to talk to folks about this particular issue. But it is really important for businesses who are looking for some certainty and looking to try to make sure that they can, do what they need to do to run their business in a timely manner.
Yeah, absolutely. Just for another example, and then I'll bounce to the other states. But what this bill says is you have 10 days. If there's something that you're missing on an application that's clear and that's out there for everybody to see, an organization, a municipality should reach out and say, hey, this is what's missing. Can you get it back to us? And this requires them to do so within 10 days. There's little changes that you say, well, that's not really a big deal. But when we're talking about multi-million-dollar projects, we have BEAD funding coming into our state and every other state in terms of $500 million, or $500 million, $500 million, $1 billion. There's all kinds of money coming to these states. when we have that kind of influx, we should have a timeline so we're not losing a return on our investment, and that these utilities are getting completed and that we're reaching every last mile.
Sebastian Griffin, and the director of our Junkermeyer Center for Tech and Innovation. You can see his testimony, by the way, if you'd like to go look at it on our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube, type in Mountain States Policy Center. Sebastian, thanks very much for being here. We'll see you next week. Appreciate it. Jason Mercier will bring you back on here to talk about some of the budget issues that have been going on in Montana as well. Idaho is not the only state that's cutting taxes. Montana is not that far behind in terms of what it's proposing.
Yeah, when session started, Montana had the highest regional income tax rate at 5.9. And we just talked about how Idaho went down to 5.3. That's great, but it's still the highest. Those are still two of the highest in the region. And what Montana is considering from Governor Gianforte is dropping a full point off that. So going all the way to 4.9%, which unfortunately would make Idaho the regionally highest. That's essentially an $850 million income tax reduction. But that's not the only thing Governor Gianforte is proposing. They're also looking at property tax relief. You know, the big issue across the country is property taxes, and everybody has gotten the message that there needs to be some type of relief, with the exception of Washington, which we'll get to in a moment. But Gianforte's proposal would add a homestead exemption, and that's estimated to save taxpayers approximately 15% on their property tax bill. And finally, the other thing the governor wants to do is business equipment is subject to property tax in Montana. That's really a very bad way to tax. You don't want to be taxing the instruments of production. So the governor wants to increase the exemption from $1 million to $3 million. And by doing that, especially for farmers, because you think about how expensive their equipment is, that would exempt about 700 farms, small businesses, and ranches in Montana from that business property tax. So the income tax reduction, the property tax relief, and the business property exemption are the three proposals from the governor. Montana, as you indicated, still has got a couple months to go. They just had their halfway mark about a week and a half ago. So nothing has actually made it through the legislative process yet on taxes. And there are dozens of different ideas from lawmakers about what to do with the income tax and property tax. But at the end of the day, I think it's pretty safe to say taxes will be reduced by the time Montana's session ends. We just don't know yet how much it's going to be.
Yeah, and Wyoming, Jason, as we're putting up on the screen here, they have also cut taxes. You know, this is a theme here in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. Not so much in Washington, which is part of the reason we're putting that last. The bad news comes last here for our friends in Washington. But let's talk quickly about Wyoming.
Yeah, so Wyoming, again, property taxes a bit. So why are property taxes a big deal in Idaho and Montana and Wyoming? Now, we indicated it's a budget-driven process, but because of, Maddie was talking about the abusive use of emergency powers on the West Coast from the governors of California and Oregon and Washington. So what happened is people said we've had enough, and they moved. They moved to Idaho, they moved to Montana, they moved to Wyoming. And with that comes increased service pressures and increased housing prices. And that's kind of why you've seen one of the big tax priorities in these states is property tax relief. So again, you had multiple proposals in Wyoming. Their session is done. They are done for the year. And what they adopted was a 25% reduction, basically, in the property tax burden at the local level up to $1 million worth of your home. So up to $1 million, 25% of that's going to be reduced. The problem, again, kind of like what was happening with the Idaho, it didn't address the spending. So while that property tax has been reduced, they didn't do anything else. So now there's the question of what are the local governments going to add other type of taxes or fees to make that up, because they didn't address the spending.
Jason, well, that's a fun. There you go. It's kind of strange how that happens once in a while. I guess the system knew that we were headed to some bad news. Let's look at Washington State. And I want to start, Jason, by just looking at the increase in the budgets in Washington State. You know, we watch Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and some folks over there say, especially in some parts of Montana and Wyoming, say specifically, oh, the budgets are just increasing too high. I mean, I guess you really haven't seen a budget increase until you looked at the Washington State budget, which is quite remarkable.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of that joke, when you hear about complaints about overspending in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, you can see Washington sitting at the bar saying, hold my beer, let me show you how to do out of control spending. And I think that, before we get into the details of this, of the 4 states, only one of them is facing a budget problem. And of the 4 states, only one of them has not prioritized tax relief and constraining budget growth. So it should not be a surprise that the one state that hasn't provided any tax relief in the past decade, the one state that hasn't been fiscally disciplined, is the only state of the 4 facing a budget shortfall. And that's Washington. And what I mean by budget shortfall, it's not that their revenues have decreased. It's not that their revenues are dropping. Their revenues are still growing. It's just that their budget is growing at twice the rate of that revenue growth, which is why they're having a challenge right now. And their response to that challenge is in the legislature to double down, right? Over the past several years, not only have they not cut taxes, but they added the first in the nation standalone tax on capital gains income. They've increased business taxes. That was in the past, in the good times, while they were still growing their budget. Now that they've got a shortfall, their response has not been, let's take a step back. Let's look at right-sizing our budget. Let's look at trying to figure out, did we really have to double our spending over the past decade? Or are there some efficiencies we can be looking at? No, that's not the conversation. The conversation is, you know what? We haven't raised enough taxes. We haven't invented enough economically damaging ways to tax businesses and employers. So let's show the world how you can have a really damaging tax strategy. And that's the 2025 legislative session. And how that breaks down, they want to impose the first in the Western Hemisphere. Doesn't exist anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. The only place that this type of tax exists is in barely a handful of countries in Europe, and that is a wealth tax. $12 billion over the next 4 years. First in the Western Hemisphere wealth tax. And oh, by the way, it's probably unconstitutional in Washington and so problematic to implement that the Department of Revenue did a study on this, produced a report to lawmakers back in November of last year, and said, there are a lot of challenges to this. We don't really know how to estimate the revenue. It's going to be very hard to administer, and people are probably going to do what they've done in Europe when this passed and leave the state. But we can still go forward with that if you want to. And the legislature's response has been, well, let's go forward with that. So there's the wealth tax. They also want to have a payroll tax. So basically a tax on people that you hire for how many people are working for you. They also want to have a tax based upon how much you're paying your employees. While Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming are providing property tax relief, the proposal in Washington is to repeal a voter-approved restriction on property taxes and allow them to grow at the rate of inflation while also repealing a dozen business exemptions. So if you take all of those taxes combined over the 4-year period, and we say a 4-year period because Washington has a 4-year budget outlook, that's $20 billion of tax increases. Now, Governor Little jokingly awarded former Governor Lee Inslee the Idaho Realtor of the Year Award. If these taxes pass, I think that's going to need to be awarded to every single lawmaker in Washington that votes for this budget.
Yeah, we're going to bring in Bob Pishue in just a second. Bob is one of our policy analysts at MSPC. Bob, what Jason was just mentioning about the taxes is nowhere near the end of the story. We're also talking about transportation taxes, which you've studied quite a bit. Let's put up on the screen the specific transportation taxes. We'll go through them one by one. Get your thoughts here. An electric vehicle registration fee hike from 100 to 150. The electric vehicle hybrid and hybrid vehicle fee increases of 2% each year. Basically doubling of the rental car tax, a new surcharge on selling electric bicycles, an increase in driver's license fees. Oh yeah, and by the way, a huge increase in the state gas tax in Washington state. Now, Washington has made its bed here. It's going to have to sleep in it. But the reason why these are so interesting from our perspective, Bob, is that you're going to have a lot of people who are going to be coming to Idaho now, even more so perhaps than they were before. And when they come back into Washington state, they might, there's a rumor that they might see this sign on the state highway when they come back in. because that is how extreme some of these proposals are in Washington State, Bob.
Yeah, and then you look at other types of taxes like carbon taxes and things like that, and that only increases the burden on drivers and freight movers even more. So that's one thing we're paying attention to. And as you mentioned, with more people moving to the mountain states, we expect things to, that's more demand on our road network in Idaho and Montana and others. And so just recently, the Reason Foundation put out a report, and Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, ranked fairly well at 15th, 16th, and 12th, respectively. The oddball out is Washington State, which ranked 47th in the country in terms of on the highway report. Now, they took a look at a whole bunch of different aspects of highways, safety, preservation and maintenance, and spending. Where some of the mountain states, didn't pose so well in these specific areas, but overall they got a good ranking. Idaho, for example, Idaho and Washington ranked not so good. 49th for Idaho, 50th for Washington in terms of spending on bridges and capital infrastructure. One thing to note, though, nationally, I mean, this isn't just a problem in the mountain states, although we have our own unique situations, weather fluctuations, ice to warm weather. And so those are issues. But, asphalt costs and materials costs since COVID have ballooned nationally. And there's been a little bit of relief on that, but we'll see moving forward. It depends a lot on how tariffs look and other things, as we move forward. So that's one recommendation that we really got to look to, private sector technologies to really reduce the cost of materials and how we use those materials to keep those costs low, so that Idaho and the mountain states do not look to raising the gas tax to reach, Washington levels.
Bob, that report that you were talking about is on our website. I know you did a analysis of it about a week ago, I think it was. So if anybody wants to see where their state ranks, you can go to mountainstatespolicy.org. Check that out. Also, just a reminder, if you have questions, comments, add them to the chat. We will get to them throughout the program today. Bob, I do want to ask you one more question about the transportation taxes that are coming out of Washington. One of the proposals was what's called the VMT. Can you explain to our viewers what the VMT is and why folks in Washington ought to be concerned, but also, look, this has the potential to come to other states as well if policymakers were to take the wrong path?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. A lot of states, even, in the Western US, especially, have been looking to what's called a VMT tax. That's transportation technical speak for the amount people drive. And so what that would do is it would tax the amount people drive by the number of miles. The real sticky points with that are in Washington State, for example, the local MPO, that's the equivalent of Compass in the Boise area. They were looking at altering that depending on the time of day. So for example, it would charge you, 3 cents a mile at 8 o'clock at night, but might charge you 5 or 6 cents a mile during the congested periods of the day, right? And that's to regulate the amount people drive or change driver behavior. And so that right there is one reason to be concerned. Another to be concerned is that Washington was looking to divert some of those driver fees to other modes like transit and cycling and things like that. And we believe that the taxes and fees that drivers pay should go back to benefit them. Thankfully, that got tabled. And so, hopefully that has signaled to the rest of these states that we're not ready for that tax. The public does not want that tax. Diverting driver fees to all of these other modes when our roads are continuing to languish and fall apart and return to gravel is not a good idea. So thankfully that's been tabled for now, but it is something to pay attention to. It's talked about in a lot of places. So we'll continue to monitor that and let you know when these issues come up.
Bob Pishue, one of our policy analysts here at Mountain States Policy Center. Bob, thanks for being here. We'll see you next week as well. Jason, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about some of the issues that are going on federally with these departments, specifically Department of Education and Medicaid reform as well. We have a big opportunity here to reform the way we provide government and do government, not only federally, but also in the states. And it's been pretty nice to see Governor Little, Superintendent Critchfield, and others be on form with trying to get some of these dollars directly to the states.
Yeah, I was actually just on a call this morning with officials from the Federal Department of Education where they were talking about with these changes, they are really encouraging states to submit applications to the federal government for waivers, for grants. And they said, just because we or a prior administration denied your work requirement for Medicaid in the past or some type of combining of education funds into one pot of money, don't take that as a no forever. Send us your new submissions and take advantage of this opportunity to really innovate and get back to that federalist process, right? Where just because there are some federal funds that are being provided, that they don't come with all of the strings and all of the regulations of the past. There's an opportunity for more flexibility. So the message that you're hearing, it's been exciting. It's been messy as well as far as what's been happening. But the clear message is from governors, for lawmakers, for state agency directors, take advantage of this opportunity to just ask. All they can do is say no. So ask for whatever you've been thinking about in the past as far as innovative ways to deliver education services or healthcare services or environmental services, because the clear message is a prior no is not a no forever, and take advantage of that. Now, at the same time, we talked about Washington's budget problems. Well, you may have heard that there's a hard time enacting budgets in Congress, and we're facing a $36
you don't say.
facing a $36 trillion national debt. And what that means in real terms is our interest payments on that debt right now are higher than what we spend for the defense spending. They're basically higher for everything except for Social Security. That's a problem, not only just from a standpoint of budgeting, but for economic growth. So you just probably heard recently about press conferences between Governor Little and Governor DeSantis of Florida, and Governor Gianforte and Governor DeSantis, making the push really from the executive level of state governors that we've got to get this fiscal situation resolved at the federal level. And realistically, the political incentives are not there for Congress to do the right thing. Right? Nobody's campaigning on having to make tough budget decisions when they can just keep kicking that can down the road until eventually that bill comes due. So governors and lawmakers are starting to realize Congress is not going to voluntarily start to do the right thing fiscally, so that their hand needs to be forced. And one way to do that, to try to really get them to do a balanced budget amendment, is something that's called an Article 5 convention. You've seen states have these resolutions. Unfortunately, they failed this year in Idaho, Montana. And part of the reason why they fail is there's the concern of the unknown. Right? There's never been an Article 5 convention. What's going to happen if this occurs? There's always fears that it would be a runaway convention. I think that the peace of mind and the safeguard I would give you that is anything that comes out of an Article 5 convention requires 3/4 of the states have to agree to it. You can't get 3/4 of the states to agree to what time they're going to have lunch. So it's very unlikely you'd see something radically approved.
Jason, Bob, Madi, Sebastian, the entire gang will be at MSPC's spring dinner on Friday, April 11th in Coeur d'Alene with Judge Janine Pirro. We hope you'll join us on April 11th. If you've got your tickets, great. If you don't, hurry up, get online, mountainstatespolicy.org to see Judge Janine Pirro and the entire staff and board of MSPC. Come to Coeur d'Alene, celebrate free markets with us on Friday, April 11th. Go to mountainstatespolicy.org right now to get your tickets. And by the way, we've also announced that our fall dinner and anniversary gala in Boise, October 9th, will feature George Washington University law professor Jonathan Turley. He is one of the great legal minds in the country today, and he will be joining us at our fall dinner and anniversary gala, again, October 9th in Boise. And then our Montana Liberty Dinner will feature Dr. Ben Carson, November 6th in Billings. Hope you can join us for all 3 events. Our Montana Liberty Dinner, our fall dinner in Boise, our spring dinner in Coeur d'Alene. Go to mountainstatespolicy.org to get your tickets today for all 3 of these events. You will not want to miss it, and we hope you'll join us for that free market celebration. For Jason and all of us here at Mountain States Policy Center, thank you very much for being with us, and we will see you again next time here on Peak Policy.
Thanks for watching Mountain States Policy Center. To stay up to date on the work of MSPC, visit mountainstatespolicy.org or find us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Mountain States Policy Center. Free markets first.
She's no nonsense.
It's okay. Be here, end up murdering the children of American citizens. You know what's
A former judge, a former district attorney, and now co-host of The Five.
If we have the will and the determination to ignore the noisy minority.
Judge Janine Pirro is coming to North Idaho, and you're invited to the festivities. Join Judge Janine at the Coeur d'Alene Resort on Friday, April 11th. Tickets are going fast. Register now at mountainstatespolicy.org. That's mountainstatespolicy.org.
It's the ideas that matter. The Mountain States Policy Manual is a 200-page guide filled with facts, figures, and recommendations on everything from agriculture to education, healthcare, and even transportation. Ideas backed up by years of research, including how to expand on education reform, improving the transparency and accountability of government, lowering healthcare costs, and improving patient care, limiting regulations so our small businesses can thrive, and limiting the tax burden we're placing on our families. No other tool will help a lawmaker lead, a journalist write, or an everyday citizen hold their government accountable more than the Mountain States Policy Manual. Because in the end, it's not about the personalities or even the politics, it's about the policies. Visit mountainstatespolicy.org or find the policy manual on Amazon.